welcome to the Housing Sector Podcast. Today I'm joined by Giles Grover of End Our Cladding Scandal. Giles, thank you very much indeed for your time today. Would you like to give a little introduction about yourself and a bit of background?
Uh, sure, yes. So I'm Giles. I helped form a campaign group, Manchester Gladiators, in 2019. I'm one of the leads of End Our Cladding Scandal. It's going back a bit further. I've been a leaseholder since 2008 of a flat in Manchester, um, on the residential management company as well. We found out our home was unsafe literally 3 weeks after Grenfell. We were told that we had the same Category 3 ACM cladding. So I've had a bit of a different approach to this in terms of I became the property manager of my building as well, which was a terrible idea, but the right thing at the time because the managing agent wasn't doing so well. So long story short, impacted leaseholder, residential manager company director, campaigner for the last 5, 6, 7 years. Far too long, to be honest.
Okay, and for anyone who might not understand, what exactly is the cladding scandal?
So the cladding scandal essentially started, or people became made aware of it following the fire at Grenfell Tower in June 2017. They had a litany of issues there. A lot of people have said, it's mainly the cladding, the ACM cladding, that's what the government was focused on. But whilst that might have been a key factor in it, there's lots of other defects, whether it's insulation, whether it's the fire doors. But essentially, a lot of this started with you got dangerous cladding that seemed to have spread fire very quickly. So a lot of buildings across the country started getting checked to see if they had that same cladding. Um, but again, that was ACM cladding first, then it was other types of cladding. It was buildings over 80 meters, then it's different height buildings, and you've got other defects as well. So essentially, as we've always said, we started off as gladiators, End Our Cladding Scandal, but as we've said all along, it started as a cladding scandal and quickly turned into a building safety crisis because once you see issues with the cladding, then there's a whole range of other issues that are all the root cause of it is the government's deregulation for over 30 or 40 years, just ignoring warnings, not really caring what was built, no real oversight, but it's a bad practice across the industry. Developers, product manufacturers, contractors, left, right, and centre. Everyone just thinking, no one's going to check, no one's going to look at what we're actually doing. So let's just cut a few corners, left, right, here, there, and everywhere. Which then came out in the last few years. The scandals just getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and the previous government, couldn't sort it. This government's taking its sweet time, let's say.
So now we know that cladding's bad. Are they still building new buildings with cladding, or are we rushing to judgment on cladding here? Is some cladding good?
Yeah, I mean, cladding's now kind of become an overall, a catch-all term for all fire safety defects. As I say, there's still kind of a focus a bit on cladding as well, the unsafe cladding. But the government's now, since 2018, banned the use of combustible materials on buildings over 80 meters. Buildings under 80 meters, you can still use all sorts of different, potentially unsafe material. Um, so yeah, there's still a whole range of factors where we're still concerned that okay, over 80 meters things might start getting better. Under 80 meters, there's still a lot of confusion, uncertainty.
For those of you who have noticed, Giles is now in a different room. This is because his family have arrived and people go. We are always flexible here at the housing sector. So look, it's okay. It's not just cladding. It's
Mm,
other issues within the building of new builds, and then there's a lot of existing stock. So if we just
yeah.
focus on the cladding at the minute, I thought after Grenfell there had been all the investigations. We realised cladding was bad, and that the government had said, right, well, we need to replace all this cladding now. Is that not happening?
Mm. Uh, Not really. So the government essentially, the first 2 years after Grenfell, the Conservatives at the time, they were saying, okay, building owners, developers, everyone do the right thing. Fix those buildings, despite there being no legal obligation to do so. Leasehold law played a big part in this as well because, whatever the issues were found, they could just be charged to the leaseholders. So the government's always said all these warm words and do the right thing, but it's always focused on kind of minimizing the scale of this crisis by saying, okay, it's overly ACM and over 80 meters, so we'll give some funding there, no more funding. That was in public housing in 2018. Private housing, then, soon after we set up, we got, another couple 100 million ACM over 80 meter buildings. But they just kept saying, below 18 meters buildings, oh, it's not a problem. Other cladding, okay, it's not as bad, but get it checked. But actually, once you start looking at the advice notes, then it's kind of clear that the government was publishing them saying essentially, you need to do the checks and you need to remove it. Where it went really wrong was they had advice note 14. You had the government came out essentially. I'll get into the technical details, so I'm trying to keep it relatively simple. Came out with saying industry needs to come up with a solution to make sure that lending can continue because there's so much confusion around heights, materials, balconies, various issues. So they came up with the EWS1 form, but literally 3 weeks later in January 2020, they consolidated the advice notes and said you've got to check all buildings, all heights. So since that point, that's when everything just got exponentially worse. That's when, as Manchester Gladiators, we used to deal with kind of 40s to 60 buildings. But then from that point on, within 3 months, it was over 100 buildings that we were trying to support as well. So it started off with certain heights, it started off with certain materials, but all the funding has sort of been playing catch up with, the identification of further issues. So it's kind of just, stop start. I mean, it should be really going downhill. Every so often there's a bit of, a bit of glimmer of good hope, a bit of hope that there'll be funding, the laws change, but it's never quite been enough to deal with the full quantum of this issue, whether it's cladding, not just cladding, because again, getting into too much detail possibly, but I live in a building, I know many buildings where they got funding for half the issues, just cladding, like ACM timber, but you didn't get funding for the brickwork system issue. You might have dangerous combustible insulation there, but you won't get funding for it. But it's still present, it still needs to be remediated. So that's where we've gone from one get rid of everything to now they're trying to say we need to be proportionate about it because everything's in such a mess, really, that they're allowing, combustible materials still to be used below 18 meters. So now they're trying to say, well, you'd have to fix it all. But then, insurers, lenders, fire engineers, building owners, leaseholders, residents, everyone's got a different view of what safety is and what horrible, risk to life is, really. So there's a long way to go before we can feel safe and be safe in our homes, as the government keeps telling us. So a very long-winded answer. I've got a lot of, I start with one answer and end up answering about 25 things. So
That's good.
hopefully this all
I
makes
like long
sense, really.
answers, and people don't need to hear me talk. And I don't know anything about it. I'm the one coming to you saying, share this knowledge with me. So it's great. What, just to put this in context, how many floors is an 80-meter building? Three, four?
So 80 meters usually is around 6 floors. And this is one of the interesting things as well that, and we've seen it recently where a lot of developers, you'll see a lot of 6 floor buildings that are just below 18 meters. So in theory, the stricter regulations, for want of a better word, they kicked in over 18 meters historically, the last 2, 3 decades. So one of my buildings in the 3 block development was built at 17.8 meters.
Yeah.
So just below 18 meters. They actually reduced the building safety fund tolerance by 30 centimeters to account for that, because that was the gaming of the system. And we've seen this recently, in fact, in Bromley, where now they've got second staircases required over 18 meters. They're not starting to build just below, 17.7 meters. So we just need one staircase. So industry's still saying, oh, we've changed our culture, we've done it now. We're good boys, but they're still going to game as much as possible. All these heights, all these thresholds, they're still going to focus on their profits. Some would say rightly because they're PLCs, but the people who've got to live in the bloody flats would say wrongly, really.
But if I was building you a car and I said,
Mm.
okay, it's cheaper to not put brakes on, and it's okay
Uh,
because your car's not going
uh,
over 40 mile an hour, I wouldn't be allowed to sell you that, would I?
yeah, I mean that's what it's always been said that in terms of consumer protection rights, we maybe things are starting to improve now, but it's still kind of a bit piecemeal, really, and it's still confusing in terms of getting proper protections, redress, etc. But it was always the case, you buy a kettle, you buy a toaster, and you got more consumer rights, more consumer protections than if you buy, the biggest purchase most people will make in their life, really. So yeah, I think that's one of the things that is still scrabbling around, and particularly with, this government wanting to build so many more homes there. They say their priorities aren't affecting each other, but it's kind of clear on the ground they are in lots and lots of different ways. So yeah, we still don't feel like, and leasehold law, as I say, is the other issue where historically that's the culture that's always been the case, that developers could just throw up all sorts of rubbish, sell it onto a freeholder, a couple of million quid. They can move on. The freeholder, any issues, they just charge us. They'll just
Yeah.
force us to pay for them. I had that in my building where after 6 years we had leaks all over the place. Our developer, I won't name them, even though it's public knowledge, our developer wasn't collecting any reserve funds either, so service charges kept artificially low, which is still happening. Sold the title onwards. The next thing we know, our service charges start going up. So we formed a residential management company to take control of that. But it's still leasehold law. There's still too much power in these freeholders, even housing associations as well. I won't get into them necessarily, but yeah, they've got some interesting tactics and behaviours for charities, shall we say.
Yeah, and not for profits, it seems very focused on
Mm,
profits. And if you're a not for
mm,
profit and yet you're building a house on the cheap because it's not safe but it's cheaper, that sort of doesn't bode well,
yeah.
does it?
Yeah, I think a lot of these, I've said it before, and I don't think they're big fans of it, but the housing associations, we said all along, they need to focus on their core purpose of making sure people have got safe and decent homes. They've spent too long being these kind of, we call them tin pot developers. They're not big fans of that, but they all think they're going to be some sort of sexy developers building new homes, when actually you can't even make your bloody home safe in the first place, really.
That's the backlash we see whenever my landlord claims, "Oh look, we're handing over 60 new buildings to new residents, new needed homes. Here's the local MP supporting this," and then you get the backlash from the residents going, "You're not looking after my home."
Yeah, yeah, and I can understand that, that we need more homes. Absolutely. I mean, I've seen again, everyone's got different views. I'm from Manchester. I think I prefer the council doing it. No entity or authority is going to be perfect. And some of these house associations, I'm also kind of on this side in terms of they shouldn't have to pay for the cladding remediation, etc., because otherwise tenants pay for it indirectly.
Yeah.
But as I say, some of the buildings that I've seen they've developed, the joint ventures that they've got into as well, I'm trying to unpick those now. We're seeing on the ground that they're now engaging in lengthy disputes, protracted court cases with dates next year, the year after, just because they're avoiding responsibility and trying to force someone else to pay. Again, people just sat in the middle waiting for their homes to be safe. Everyone's just always saying, yeah, leaseholders, residents are utmost priority, but reality on the ground is that actions never quite match the words, sadly.
One thing we see, and it's a lot of the slogans on X, is that leaseholders are now trapped. They're trapped in unsafe buildings. Are you one of these people who is trapped in your home? You cannot sell it.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't necessarily move. Well, I always used to be happy in my home, and I thought I'm never going to leave here. I think for a lot of people, especially being trapped, being stuck in this mess and not really, knowing what the next steps in your life are, a lot of people do now sort of think, right, I'm never going to buy a leasehold again, never going to buy a flat again. So I haven't tried to sell mine, but I mean, I did try to remortgage a few times in 2021, but I wasn't able to, even with my own lender. I finally managed to in towards the end of 2022, but that by that point, that was after the Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng budget as well, and interest rates shooting up. So obviously, my bank then decided to let me mortgage. So, but ultimately, yeah, there's you know thousands, tens of thousands of people that aren't able to sell up, that aren't able to get a mortgage on their property, despite the lenders having made commitments over 2 years ago. Those commitments are only to consider lending because then it's all about their risk protocols, etc. Which again, commercially, maybe I can understand that, but there's all these, commitments, announcements that you think, fine, we're making headway through this, but there's too many complexities. There's too many different protections. You got to get a leaseholder certificate. You might be qualifying, you might be non-qualifying. There's different landlords, housing associations. Everyone's doing something slightly differently. So, as we've said it, we met the economic secretary to the Treasury yesterday. We said it, to the government, previous government, this government, that many times. The more uncertainty is, obviously the lack of confidence in the market will perpetuate. But ultimately, yeah, start going on with all these highfalutin things, but then it's the actual people that can't move on with their lives. It's the families that, you know, two, three kids maybe, but in a 1, 2 bedroom flat. But you can as well. You can rent it out quite easily. And this is where the government always says, "Oh, we'll think of things in the round," and they don't really do that. They all think in silos because You might have issues with insurance, which means it's above 1%, your service charge of the property value, which is immediate issues in affordability for if you want to sell it. Um, there's ground rent problems as well, but ultimately a lot of second steppers can't sell, so they're renting it out. You got shared owners who can't sublet. Housing associations aren't buying it back, so those houses aren't available. Non-qualifying leaseholders, if they sell on their property because they don't deserve the protections according to the government, the lack of protections passes on. So I've not done any calculations about this, but there's tens of thousands of homes at least that are just being tied up and being rented out. So you solve the building safety crisis and cladding scandal, and you can actually put some relief the market. You can relieve the people who actually feel right, have to move on. I know people who've happy taking a 10, 20, 30, 40 grand loss just because they can move on with their lives. That's justice according to the previous government, maybe this government too, sadly.
But you're really on the cold face here. So, who are the sort of people that you're supporting and coming into contact with? Who is this affecting?
It's literally all walks of life. I mean, we started again 2018, 2019 as privately sold as owner occupiers. As we've kind of gone on, we've built that was Manchester Gladiators. We all had lots of different groups. Got Birmingham Leaseholder Action Group, Liverpool Gladiators, UK Cladding Action Group, London. So we all kind of came together, and there's lots of different people, lots of different approaches and outlooks, and priorities based upon what's affecting them most. So whether it's owner occupiers, whether it's non-qualifying leaseholders who have too many properties because they've got more than three. You've got people who are shared owners as well, where we work or help set up a group, the shared owners network as well, because that's always the way that we've got sort of, as a campaign, fairly simple about the fairness of it, about the fact that as leaseholders, victims shouldn't have to pay for this crisis. But then you've got people in under 11-meter buildings who are ruled out of all help. So we try and, work as a campaign together, but then support other people so they can, like we support the leaseholder disability advice group as well, because they've got very specific issues about peeps where, first meeting with Michael Gove in October 2021, 45 minutes, they got 5 minutes on it. So okay, that was a start, but hang on a minute, they should have an hour to get into those discussions. So we'll we'll support everyone who's an impacted leaseholder or resident. That's the thing. It's sometimes we call ourselves leaseholders, then leaseholders quite dehumanizing. So we're residents, but then people, when Gove came in and said, I'll protect people who are, leaseholders or residents in their flats, it was like, what about the people with more than one flat? So I think we go with leaseholds now because we feel that we're not quite homeowners. We're not tenants. We've got slightly more rights, but we're not full on homeowners. So going back to your question, ultimately, anyone who's impacted by this, we will try to support as much as possible, whether that's directly through campaigns and whether it's supporting them, whether it's introducing the right people, signpost them, getting meetings with the government, etc., etc.
So I've been sort of, and I suspect, like you, becoming a sort of campaigner for housing was never on my radar. It was never something that I sat down and go, right, that's where I'm going. That's what I'm going to do.
Yeah.
And in the last 10 years, I was always amazed at how many different groups there were. But we seem
Mm,
to be coming together now to say, well, actually, you might be a leaseholder stuck with cladding, but
mm.
fire safety issues, shared ownership, and social housing. But we've all got the same sort of common problem, isn't it? And that's our landlords
Yeah.
cutting corners.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, as I say, we started from Manchester and UK Cladding Action. We both started kind of independently around the same time. If I go back to literally 6.5 years ago, and that's the thing that you've all got your own approaches, you've all got different motivations. I've seen lots of campaigns, particularly as they hit kind of maturity, where there's splinter groups or different people with different outlooks and approaches. And I think you'll always get that, but I think it's kind of good how it works together as well, where I used to be the bad cop in Manchester Gladiators, now End Our Cladding Scandal, I'm the good cop as well, because I've got other people who are much better at being the bad cop than me. So, yeah, as I say, we work with, whether it's, campaigners on various platforms as well. It's all about where you're aligned, really. It sounds quite, I better not swear, but philosophical concepts of being aligned, etc. I mean, we always say our enemy's enemy is our friend anyway, and
Yeah.
that's whether it's leaseholds and residents or whether it's working with housing associations, freeholders, managing agents, just seeing where you're on the same page, ultimately knowing that they're focused on their backside as well. But that's where probably it's a lot easier to be on the side with leaseholders and residents because you know that 99.9% of them aren't just in it for their own back pocket, really. Although one or two still are, but that's another story entirely.
Where do you see this going in the next 5 years?
Oh God, 5 years. I mean, I'm hopeful. So what we're trying to do essentially now we've got a new government. I mean, the government hasn't really impressed us a great deal or really shown us how it's going to deliver change. But we do think over the coming months, there's a lot of potential pressure points, whether it's, they've got the response to the Public Accounts Committee report, Grenfell anniversary is coming up as well. There'll be a leasehold bill in the next session. I think they were trying to get the legislative remediation acceleration plan through this session of Parliament, but I don't think there was enough time. So I think in the next 5 years, I don't really want to, I'd like to be, out of this in the next 5 years, but I said that 2, 3, 4, 5 years, every year I say, it's time to move on. But I think now is the time that we can really try and apply pressure to this government. Keir Starmer's the one he said he's responsible for building safety. There's been a lot of warm words. Even Angela Rayner said it's time for action rather than warm words. But
Yeah.
we met her again at the end of April. It's still kind of warm words. So they've got their target dates, 2029 for all high-rise building and grant funding schemes. But that's kind of mirroring the old approach the old government, where they're focusing on ACM, which is a subset of the buildings. This government's now talking about another subset by saying only high-rise and grant funding schemes, which are around 834 out of 5,300 buildings, out of actually 11,000 estimates. So I think I think we'll start to see some progress. The government's talking about accelerated remediation, but they need legislation, as I say. The frustrating part for us and what we're really trying to push on now is all the stuff, all the issues, the obstacles, the challenges that they called out, spoke so strongly about in opposition, non-cladding defects being one, non-qualifying leaseholders, shared owners, insurance, waiting watch, under 11-meter buildings. That's where we need to see some movement. And the point we made to them repeatedly, because, and we're still hearing the same lines about, we inherited a quagmire, it's pinning
Yeah.
blancmange to the
Yeah.
wall. Um, you know, it's the same sort of lines, financial message. And it's like, well, we're not talking about finances. We will need some more finance at some point. There's ways to do that. But number one, and we said this for quite a long time, since we started our campaign in 2019, since we relaunched in 2020, and we've got we did a campaign manifest in 2023. A lot of this is about having the control from the centre. So part of this thing is that we said to the government what they need to do is provide that certainty about risk assessment. Because right now you've gone from, as I say, a zero risk approach to a tolerable approach, but that's only external walls. There's still a relatively new assessment standard. So it needs to be consistent because there's still a lot of self-interest in there. But essentially, they need to make sure there's an ability to have a holistic approach to life safety of a building. Because in theory, they're designed holistically. They're never constructed holistically, let's face it. But rather than just saying there's a strip of cladding here, well, what about internal compartmentation, particularly below 18 meters, where the compartmentation conversions as well. We see more of those where, permitted development rights, you could circumvent planning regulations. But whether it's, the number of floors or the height, whether it's the cladding, whether it's the balconies, whether it's the compartmentation, the steelwork, the opening vents, it's about saying, okay, all these factors, they'll have different risk weightings, but a holistic approach to say, is the building safe or not? You've got your FRUs, your fire supposed external walls. The standard's going to be coming out. PAS 79 was withdrawn, and they're going to update that as well. So there's lots of different standards coming out, but it's about having that certainty, and the government providing that certainty because they're the ones responsible since the 80s for deregulating and focusing on outcomes rather than prescriptive standards. Ultimately, what we really need is control from the centre. That's what we need to see that, there's too many self-interested actors. You've got, as I say, freeholders, developers, housing associations, contractors, insurers, lawyers, left, right, and centre, everyone arguing the toss. All the while, we're just sat there waiting for our homes to be made safe. So they're already kind of putting the money up for cladding. And this is where you can't make a building half safe. The Public Accounts Committee says, how are you going to deal with non-cladding defects during a remediation scheme? There's ways of doing that. And that is where you just have to say, okay, Let's make the building fully safe. Then, understand what's funded through the cladding safe scheme, understand where there's developers or contractors, or, use the law in place right now to recover the funds, but just do it after, because there's all this, arguing the toss, all this theoretical financial liability those disputes will just continue for years on end until they actually just crack on with it. So if they talk about, and again, Angela Rayner said, anyone anywhere living in an unsafe home is one person too many. And she said that a couple of months ago,
Yeah.
but they're not doing enough to support that. So I will come on to, I mean, we've got this sort of trying to work out cheesy strap lines like consistency, central control, cash, certainty, confidence. There's too many C's flying around, but essentially cash, funding. I think there's, I'll have to check the stat, but is it 9, 10 billion out there? They've moved the building safety levy back, which is slightly frustrating, well, to put it mildly. But there's so many parties that, if they're saying industry is responsible, Michael Gove on the 10th of January 2022 said he'll make industry pay instead of leaseholders. 3 years later, they're like, oh, we can't do product manufacture. It's too difficult. They're offshore. We won't get enough money from them. All we get from housing, MHCLG, is reasons why they can't do stuff and reasons why they should. That's been the frustrating bit. And I must, as I say, even with social housing providers, rather than every single building disputes, working out who's responsible, trying to litigate, etc., they need to just essentially say, especially for those housing associations, contractors, get the building fixed, which I think they'll start to do in terms of there's a treasury spending review, social house remediation strategy. I don't know what's going to come out of that. I think it's a clearer pathway to say fix those buildings. And as far as I'm concerned, and a lot of the contractors, their bodies are concerned, they'd rather be paying into a levy system, certainty of a month of a yearly contribution rather than having to engage lawyers. So again, long-winded way of saying consistency of risk assessments, consistency of treatment of leaseholders, control from the centre, so it takes the weight off of us from leaseholders, residents, resident management companies who are battling out with developers, and then funding, cash, spend the money that's out there and get the rest of the money from industry. Building safety levy, they said 3.4 billion over 12 years. You could easily raise double that over 20 years. Why not just do that? Could do that, but is MHCLG making the case? Is Treasury officials going to block it like they usually do? Are we just going to talk about growth, 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 and damn these poor leaseholders? Who knows?
Look, we're running out of time. It's been fascinating
Yeah,
talking to you.
sorry.
Thank you very much indeed. But I've got one last question for you. It's the 13th of May we're recording this. So next month is the anniversary of Grenfell.
Mm.
Are the homes that we're building today safer since Grenfell?
Well, not since Grenfell. I mean, before the Building Safety Act came to law, you'll have seen a lot of developers rush through developments because they thought the law's going to change. And I suspect I don't know for sure, but the building safety regulator, I think they'll be, they called in a lot of those buildings in tranche one, but I suspect they'll have found some that are unsafe. I know one that was completed, say, 2019 that's unsafe. You've then got the regulations transferred to the building safety regulator last April, but you could have had transition arrangements. So some of the developers, whether new buildings or fixing old buildings, would try and make sure we've had a meaningful start when they haven't all. So I think we'll start to see that with high-rise buildings. Obviously, there's the BSR, the building safety regulator. There's a lot of delays with their resourcing, with their models as well. I've got some sympathy for them in terms of they're the ones, that should have been obviously building control should have been doing this about 20, 30 years ago. They're saying it's developers and designers, but we're still seeing this blame game where developers, architects saying it's the BSR. I think it is the BSR in terms of their resourcing. They're taking 20, 30 weeks, but they need more resource. But I'd rather they take time making sure these buildings are built correctly. However, developers are now weaponizing that, and that's where we go into the competing priorities. They're saying, housing associations saying we can't build, so we need more funding. Developers saying we're not getting our approvals quickly enough. Oh, our culture's changed, don't worry about it. Just give us the approvals later down the line because, that makes some sort of sense. So I think over 18 meters, I think we'll get in there. Under 18 meters, whilst there might start to be, I think there's, approved inspectors regimes, etc. I've still got a concern that whether it's new builds or remediation, they're still going to go to the old process, the old pick your own pick your own building control. That's my concern more than anything. So I think, the government always talks about industry culture change. I mean, the government needs to change its culture as well, let's face it, but none of these things are going to happen overnight. So I'm hopeful, by the end of this parliament, we'll be in a better place. But we leaseholders, residents need to see all this happening right now, because otherwise we'll just see all this crapping again, another 15, 20 years, really. So hopefully I won't have to still be around then or start another bloody campaign.
Yeah, hopefully we'll be doing something
Mm,
different. Giles, thank you
mm.
very much indeed for your time. I've come away
Yep.
more scared than I was before and knowing more.
Sorry about that.
Every conversation is an education to me, so thank you. And if you're a campaigner or you'd like to come on, please come on, join the conversation. For now, Giles, thank you very much indeed for your time. It's
Yep.
been very
Thank
insightful.
you.